The desert was endless that day, an ocean of light and silence that swallowed everything living. Heat shimmered above the dunes like the breath of some invisible god. In that furnace of gold, a caravan crept slowly, the sand whispering against the hooves of tired horses. Then the sky changed. The wind gathered without warning, furious and ancient, sweeping the land into chaos. The sun vanished behind a swirling wall of dust, and voices were lost to the storm. Through that roaring blindness, Chief Talon Windfeather clutched at the reins, but the desert pulled harder. His people vanished behind the sand, their calls fading into nothing. He stumbled forward alone, his steps heavy, his breath a ghost. When the storm finally passed, he fell to his knees beneath a sky too wide for mercy, and the desert watched in silence. He collapsed, his body surrendering to the burning ground. A viper slid from the shadow of a rock, its movement smooth and deliberate. Its tongue tasted the air, sensing the weakness of the man who could no longer lift his head. The creature's scales glimmered, reflecting the cruel sun. It drew closer, each slither a heartbeat. Its mouth opened, fangs glistening death-ready. But then a single sound cracked across the desert, a gunshot sharp enough to break time itself. The viper's body coiled once, then went still. Smoke curled from the barrel of a revolver in the distance. The man who held it was a stranger to this land. Elias Kane, 30 years old, rode a black horse that gleamed with sweat and dust. He was tall, broad, and carried the kind of quiet strength that belonged to people who had seen too much and spoken too little. His shadow stretched long across the dunes, bending with the land's pulse. He holstered his revolver and dismounted, his boots sinking into the sand. The stranger on the ground was still breathing, but only barely. Elias lifted the man with the gentleness of someone who understood how fragile a life could be when the desert decided otherwise. He gave him water from his flask, holding his head as one might hold a brother's. The man's lips trembled, a whisper escaping them, words Elias couldn't understand. The wind carried the sound away before it could become a plea. That night the desert cooled to silver. Elias built a small fire and laid the man beside it. He cleaned the sand from his wounds and tore a strip from his own shirt to bind them. He offered food, though the man could not eat, and kept vigil through the long hours when the world seemed to hold its breath. The stars looked down like distant eyes, and Elias wondered who this stranger was and why fate had set their paths to cross in this desolate place. When dawn touched the dunes with pale light, the man stirred, his breath returning in fragile bursts. For the first time, Elias saw the lines of wisdom and leadership in his face and knew this was no ordinary traveler. By sunrise, the horizon filled with movement, shadows and figures emerging from the dunes. A caravan approached, the sound of hooves like a heartbeat returning. Among them rode a young woman, her posture straight and proud, her eyes wide with fear and hope. She leapt from her horse the moment she saw the fallen chief. "Father," she whispered, kneeling beside him. He opened his eyes, and relief flooded his features. Then his gaze shifted to Elias, and gratitude passed between them, silent, pure. The young woman looked at the stranger, at his dust-streaked face and steady hands. Her name was Arya Windfeather, 20 years old, daughter of Chief Talon. Her beauty was not fragile, it carried the strength of wind-carved stone, of rivers that refused to die in drought. When her eyes met his, time seemed to slow. Something ancient stirred in the space between them. She spoke softly in the tongue of her people, then in halting English. "You saved my father." Her voice trembled like a note of music unsure if it wished to end. Elias nodded once, his hat in his hands, unable to find the right words. Her gaze lingered, curious and searching, before she turned back to her father. The caravan soon moved on, but she glanced back only once, her eyes full of something she didn't yet understand. Days passed, and Elias thought of her more than he cared to admit. He set up camp near a dry creek bed, repairing saddles and oiling his revolver, trying to quiet his thoughts. The desert was lonely company. Then one afternoon, a shadow crossed his tent. It was her. Arya rode a chestnut horse and carried a small clay jug of water. "My father sends thanks," she said. Elias nodded, but she didn't leave. They spoke of simple things. The weather, the distance to the next town, the way the stars seemed closer in this part of the world. She returned the next day and the next after that. Sometimes she brought bread, sometimes herbs. Sometimes she brought nothing at all, just silence and a smile that lingered too long. Evenings stretched soft and golden. They would sit by the fire, and she would hum the old songs of her people while the sky turned violet. Elias would listen, memorizing the shape of her voice, the way her laughter seemed to belong to a time before sorrow. Once, when she reached to brush dust from his sleeve, his hand accidentally brushed hers. The touch was brief, but it felt as though the whole world had leaned closer to listen. Neither spoke, but something wordless grew between them, fragile as smoke and just as real. But love, when it blooms against the laws of the world, draws attention like flame in darkness. The tribe began to whisper. Elders shook their heads. Young warriors watched with suspicion. The chief, torn between gratitude and duty, summoned his daughter. "He is brave," he said softly, "and I owe him my life. But our ways are not his ways." Arya lowered her head, her hands trembling. "I know," she whispered. "Yet my heart will not listen." The wind outside carried her words away, but the ache remained. That night, Elias waited at their usual meeting place, but she did not come. Days passed before he saw her again. Her face was pale, her smile forced. "They know," she said quietly. "They say I dishonor my people." He said nothing, because what could a man say when the world was against him? The next morning, he found several of the tribe's young men waiting near his camp. Their voices were sharp, their message simple. "Leave," they said, "before honor becomes anger." Elias looked at them, then at the horizon. He packed his saddlebag without a word. Arya found him just before dawn. Her eyes were red from weeping. "You're leaving?" she asked. "I have to," he said. "I won't bring trouble to your people." She took his hand, her voice breaking. "Then take my heart with you." For a moment neither moved. Then he swung into the saddle, his silhouette cutting against the rising sun. He didn't look back. She stood there long after he was gone, her tears shining like the dew that the desert never truly allowed. Peace lasted only a few days. Then, one night, the tribe woke to screams and fire. Bandits swept through the camp, men without loyalty or mercy. The sky burned red. Arya ran to defend her father, a knife in her hand, her voice calling for the warriors who were too far away. The chief fell, struck down by a blow from behind. Arya threw herself beside him, but the sound of hooves thundered from the dunes. A black horse charged into the firelight. A figure dismounted mid-ride, revolver blazing. Elias Kane had returned. He moved through the chaos like a storm given human shape. Bullets cracked, flames roared, and the bandits began to fall. His eyes burned with something deeper than rage, something close to purpose. When the last of the attackers fled, silence returned, heavy as a prayer. The tribe gathered around their wounded. Elias stood apart, the smoke curling around him, his breath ragged. Arya crossed to him, her hands shaking. "Why?" she whispered. "You could have stayed gone." He looked at her, ash streaking his face. "Because leaving you never felt right." The chief, barely conscious, reached for Elias's hand. Gratitude filled his fading eyes. When dawn came, the tribe stood together in the ruins of what had been their home. The elders, once stern, now looked at Elias with respect. The chief, leaning on his daughter, spoke with the strength he had left. "You saved us once and again," he said. "You have no blood here, but your heart speaks the same language as ours. From this day on, you are not our guest, you are one of us." Arya stepped forward, her eyes wet with both relief and resolve. The tribe watched as she turned to Elias, her voice clear and trembling. "You saved my father's life, now accept me as your wife." The world seemed to stop. The desert held its breath. Elias, still dusted in ash and sorrow, took her hand as if it were the most fragile thing he'd ever touched. No words could answer such a vow, so he let his silence speak instead. That night, drums echoed beneath a canopy of stars. The tribe danced, laughter and song rising into the endless sky. Elias wore his black coat, his hat shadowing the tenderness in his eyes. Arya walked toward him in a dress of white and turquoise that shimmered like moonlit water. When her father placed her hand in his, the world felt briefly healed. Their first kiss tasted of smoke and hope and the strange sweetness of surviving what should have destroyed them. Weeks later, they rode away together, west toward the horizon where the desert met the sky. They built a small wooden cabin beside a stream that glimmered in the twilight. There they lived with their horses, their laughter, and the quiet certainty that love, once found, does not ask permission to exist. At dusk, Arya would hum her songs, and Elias would sit listening, feeling the peace he had chased all his life finally settle inside him. The desert still whispered outside their door, carrying stories to travelers who might one day stop and listen. And if you wander that way and the night wind seems to murmur in a woman's voice, soft and certain, you might hear her words still lingering across time and sand. You saved my father's life, now accept me as your wife. And if you listen closely, you'll hear his answer carried on the desert air, wordless, steady, eternal.